So welcome to this webinar. Thank you for taking time to join us today. We're from like the Rakuten RapidAPI team, as Zoe mentioned, and we run this like regular webinar series. And there's a bunch of different like content formats that we run. You know, we've like in the past like done demo applications or invited guest speakers like other developers to showcase their work. And then we also do thought leadership type events like this, you know, with like some of our partners and you know, other industry leaders. A quick shout out to like Jason for from the DreamFactory team to like join us this very early morning on his side. For context and awareness for all of you, recently we announced a partnership between DreamFactory and RapidAPI, or Rakuten RapidAPI, because we saw like this great fit, synergy in, you know, what both organizations do. You know, really, what DreamFactory specializes in today is in like simplified like API creation. Jason, I think, will like show some features of the platform and how it helps users like to configure as well as best practices. But API success, in our view, means so much more than that, right? Having an API is not enough because you need a lot of other things around it. You know, one of the really basic like 101 mistakes that organizations make is that they create an API, they create a dev portal, and then they call it a program. Well, it's not, right? Because the failing is that in order to have a full program, you actually need to treat APIs like products. So this requires things like, actually, how do you monetize if that's your goal? How do you find an audience? And through this chain, we can help like our users, primarily developers, build and launch applications more quickly. So, you know, the short version is that DreamFactory simplifies the API creation process. Us at Rakuten RapidAPI, we help you go public by creating monetization structures and reaching an audience in order for your API to be consumed. I'll take maybe 5 to 10 minutes to just do a quick intro about Rakuten RapidAPI, and then we'll switch gears. I'm just here. I'm gonna try to mute whoever is on the line here. I think we're okay now. Okay, so high level, I think most people here are developers, so we don't need to belabor this point. We know that APIs are building blocks for applications, and they bring 4 benefits. And just for clarity, in our world, we look at APIs as functional blocks for services. The benefits that they bring for developers are, firstly, it simplifies and accelerates your process, right? Because you can reuse off-the-shelf components rather than building from scratch. Second is that these services are provided by third parties, and this is all they do. They're really specialized in one specific field. So that means that they can provide, you know, really good quality service and give you certainty over the cost. The next point is about better quality service. Again, it's because these providers are specialists in their field, so they know what they're doing and they do it really well. And I think more crucially, they're getting paid for these services, so they take it quite seriously. And then the final point is around like innovation. It's not just about saving you effort and time and cost, but APIs also let you kind of do these crazy wild things, right? Like building blockchain or computer vision, or, you know, leverage finance data and all these things without having the knowledge yourselves, which, you know, for small organizations or just prototyping or whatever your use case is, gets you going a lot faster. in terms of like the market, we know that this market is just going like crazy. The chart in the background is actually from Google Trends if you search for the term REST API. We definitely think that the future is continuing to be bright for REST API as it continues to be the standard, even though like GraphQL is in the market now and there's a lot of buzz around it. We know that on programmable web, their API directory grows like 40% year over year for like the last 10 years, and that's going to continue. Another reason that we're really excited about this whole space is that we think that we're operating at this convergence of two like mega trends. The first one is that APIs as like a business model or a vehicle for monetization is actually quite a new phenomenon, right? 20 years ago, or less than that, actually 14 years ago, none of these companies on the left existed. So not Twilio, not Stripe, not SendGrid, not Adyen. And these companies all pioneered APIs as a distribution technology and a method for monetization. And not only have they proven that, they've hit unicorn scale. And not only that, they've hit multi-unicorn scale, and they are some of the hottest tech properties today. The other trend is actually the rise of software developers in the tech community. Right? Before, developers were seen as like a cost center. And increasingly, we know that developers are actually like a really powerful like segment. And we see this in like two data points in 2018. The first was like Microsoft's acquisition of GitHub, and then GitLab's latest funding round. These events, happen one after each other, 4 months apart. And each deal valued the user at $300 and then $1,000. So in like 4 months, we've seen the value per user like in the market like skyrocket. But the reality is that today, for using APIs, there's still a lot of challenges. And we put them roughly into these buckets. The first one is around discovery. That by some estimates, there are 30,000 APIs out there. So actually, how do you like find the right one for your service? Second, all these APIs largely reside behind individual developer portals, or at best, you might have one portal to access like a dozen APIs. And imagine having to go through this process of discovery through different sites is just really painful. The third thing is that APIs effectively inject the dependency into your application. How do you decide if the API is good enough for you? Then in the connection bucket, we know that each API is like configured a different way. So even though they might carry out a standard function like sending an SMS, how the endpoints are structured, the formats and all these things can be very different. The other issue is that access to these APIs is not always self-serve. You might have to make commitments, you might have to apply for permissions, you might not even be able to see pricing. And then finally, it's on the management bucket, where probably this is like the biggest chunk of pain because it exists through the life cycle of your application, but less readily understood upfront. And the issue is that when you're using multiple APIs, you need to see how each one of these impact your application performance. And how do you actually do that if they're all on different like dashboards? And the other thing is you've got multiple security tokens, multiple accounts, multiple payments, multiple everything from multiple APIs. In essence, the problem as we see it today is this. APIs are useful things individually, yes. But the more APIs that you use, the more difficult your life becomes. It introduces a lot of complexity. So there's this like paradox, right? So how do you actually solve this? This is the problem that we set out to why we exist. Rakuten RapidAPI today is the world's largest API marketplace. We have over 10,000 APIs and 1 million users around the world when we're processing billions of API calls per month. Effectively, what we are is the App Store for APIs. That's like our mission and vision. The value that we bring for users, our developers, are firstly, get access to like a best-in-class API selection, including exclusive APIs. Second, you can consume all of these APIs within one consistent UI, which means for users, it's a lot less mental fatigue. You have this built-in tool set, so you can manage your end-to-end usage through one platform. You have one single integration point to connect to multiple APIs, irregardless of who it is, whether it's SendGrid or Twilio or Nexmo or anything like that. For payments, you're able to see pricing in a clear, upfront, transparent way. And then based on these pricing tiers and your usage volumes, you can get a pretty good estimate of what you need to budget. You pay a single vendor each month, so you don't have to juggle multiple accounts. And finally, monitoring is done on a single pane of glass. Some of the our top API provider partners are companies like Microsoft, SendGrid, Crunchbase, and Skyscanner. We actually have some like pretty cool announcements coming up, so I'm not going to spoil that, but stay tuned for the next like I don't know 2 or 3 weeks. I expect you should be able to hear something. The major parts of our platform are, a single interface for just finding APIs, for testing and integrating, for connecting and managing all of these. At this point, I'm going to do a quick demo just to show you how this works. So I'm signed in here to my account. Our domain is english.api.rakuten.net. I'll just hold here for about like 30 seconds so people can like navigate there and like find it. So again, it's english.api.rakuten.net. So maybe by now you've managed to like navigate to the site. You can create an account pretty simply, just using your email address or like social login. And after you log in, this is what you'll see. This is what our UI looks like. Okay, there's a few ways to like find APIs. The first one is like on this discovery bar at top. So for instance, if I look for machine learning, you'll see we have like 77 different results, and you can click that and it opens it up in a different pane. If you scroll down, we have these like different collections of APIs. So we just onboarded line messaging to the platform, I think this week, so really happy with that. And we have like other companies you might have heard of, like SendGrid is up here. We have Crunchbase, we have Skyscanner. In the facial recognition category, we have Kairos and also Microsoft Computer Vision. You'll notice that each API has 3 performance stats. The first one is a popularity score out of 10. There is a latency in milliseconds, and then a call success rate. Then this gives you pretty objective criteria of like how good the API is. So let's take one step deeper into the API. We'll just use Microsoft Computer Vision. And this is what our API portal looks like, right? The design is like nice and clean and a lot of white space. I believe we're also going to introduce like dark mode soon. And I think, but the more fundamental point for all of you is that like now every API, no matter who the provider, is going to be the same design. After the first or second session using the platform, you'll very quickly get used to it and then figure out where to find stuff, and navigation becomes a breeze after that. Now, for us, each API portal has like 4 parts to it. The first one is endpoints, where we do most of the work. There's a details page, which contains documentation. There is a discussions tab to communicate with the API provider, as well as a pricing tab where we show like pricing tiers. So for all of you to like note, we negotiate really hard with all the API providers to secure you like the same pricing as you would by going direct to source. So the benefit for you is get all this convenience, value, and access this at no additional cost. All right. Here you see I'm already subscribed to like the basic plan, which is $0 per month and includes 5,000 calls, which is pretty affordable. Now let's go to endpoints, and we will do a test using the describe image by file endpoint. To run this, I am going to use this internet meme. I have no idea what I'm doing, and it's always a dog in some like funny situation. So we'll run this through the algorithm and see what it comes back with. In this case, the endpoint is like pretty simple. All I do is like upload the file. There's an optional parameter for like the number of candidate responses. I'll just use 2. And then I'm going to hit test endpoint to make the call. Now we can shift to the right panel, and you can see this 200 status code that tells you that the call went through. And in the captions tab here, there are indeed 2 items like we defined. And if we open this up, you can see the responses from the algorithm. The first one, well, looks pretty good. It says a dog sitting in front of a computer with a confidence score of 75%. So from this, the use case might be to programmatically describe an image and only to use the description if it hits a certain like confidence threshold, let's say 70%, in which case this one would qualify. What we do here then is to generate the code snippet on this tab, and we can generate it in like 9 different programming languages, including like Python or PHP. Basically from here, you can inject this code snippet into your application, and that's all you need to, and then you're ready to go. You'll notice that this particular rapid key, which is associated with my account, will then be the same API key for any API that we use through this platform, which makes like management of this a lot simpler. So anyhow, I mean, that's all I want to say. This time I want to reserve this time and transition it over to Jason. After this presentation, we will send out the recording, slides, as well as information about where to contact the RapidAPI or Rakuten RapidAPI and DreamFactory team. With that, I'll turn it over to Jason.
Great, thank you very much, Jed.
You bet.
I will go ahead and share my screen. And Jed, Zoe, are you able to see my screen okay?
Yeah, it looks great here.
Great.
Yeah, we could see your screen, man.
Great, thank you. So thanks again to everybody for joining us today. And while I'm eager, of course, to introduce DreamFactory, I think it makes sense to first frame the context of this discussion by talking about the challenges associated with building modern APIs. So let's go ahead and kick things off with a summary statement, if you will. And that is that building successful APIs involves much more than just, and I use air quotes, writing code, right? We're all always very eager as developers to jump into the thick of things and start writing code. But the reality is that building APIs is often a very involved process that goes beyond just writing the code. And in fact, API developers are required to take a great many factors into account, including things like the URL structure, API key management, role-based access controls, because of course you might want to strictly define what it is that different that different users can do with your APIs. Furthermore, you'll also likely need to protect your APIs by requiring user authentication. And these days, user authentication is often much more complicated than managing a bunch of usernames and passwords in a database, right? Your users might need to authenticate via Active Directory, or perhaps you'd like to take advantage of a third-party authentication solution such as OpenID Connect or Okta or Auth0. And furthermore, it's entirely possible that your authentication requirements differ on a per API basis, right? So this can get very involved very quickly. Furthermore, you're going to want to integrate real-time API monitoring and usage analytics in order to better understand your API performance and also to ensure that everything is operational 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? In days gone by, it was perhaps sometimes acceptable to have a bit of an outage, and these days that mindset has certainly changed. We're expected that these systems run hopefully without fail around the clocks, and you're going to need these sorts of tools to do that effectively. Finally, you are probably going to want to apply, I shouldn't say finally, I should say next, you're probably going to want to apply usage limits, right? To ensure, firstly, that your system resources aren't being abused. And then secondarily, perhaps because you're monetizing these APIs on a per request basis and therefore need to control the number of times that a particular subscriber hits that particular endpoint. And as Jed mentioned, many businesses make the mistake, in many cases, the fatal mistake of not treating their APIs as products, right? Again, we're always, as developers, eager to jump into the code and build something great, but at the same time, your team should consider very early on how you're going to go about reaching an audience of prospective API users, right? You've built this great API. Well, hopefully, I mean, what's going to define success? Success is going to be defined by the number of users gaining value from that. Not to mention, you're going to need to figure out how to manage API billing and collection. And for these tasks, I certainly recommend checking out our partner, Rakuten RapidAPI. And as Jed mentioned, you're going to be able to use Rakuten RapidAPI to begin monetizing your API through their online marketplace. It's going to save you the hassle of dealing with an integrated payment solution. And as Jed demonstrated, as a bonus, your API is going to be much more easily found by the thousands of developers who peruse their catalog every day, right? That way you can focus on building the API and integrating all of the best practices described on this particular slide and leave the other billing and discovery related matters to the experts. So all of these decisions, and I've purposefully, probably broken every PowerPoint rule in the book by giving you the proverbial wall of text here, right? Because I wanted to really make clear that there are all of these different decisions that need to be made when you're building these APIs. And furthermore, they compound in both number and complexity as companies continue expanding API usage throughout the enterprise, right? And in my experience, I've been building APIs and working in software for 20 years now. That the net result of repeatedly making these difficult decisions is often chaos, right? You're already faced with tough deadlines. You're faced with a fractured development process in some cases, inadequate staffing. And as a result, many enterprise API environments are regularly assembled in piecemeal fashion. They don't supply or apply security safeguards in a uniform way. And in many, many cases, unfortunately, they often lack documentation. So that said, I find this particular dilemma very interesting because it resembles the state of web application development prior to the emergence of web frameworks such as those presented on the screen, Ruby on Rails, Grails, or Laravel. And for those of you who've worked in software for more than 10 years, you probably remember a time before these frameworks where you had to make all of these decisions about how you're going to manage your routes, how you're going to do form validation, how's the application going to interact with the database, how is the dynamic data going to be injected into your views, how are the layouts going to be managed. There are all of these decisions that you had to make before you actually started building the application itself, right? And it just made for a very slow and tedious development process. And that point really brings me to DreamFactory. In a nutshell, DreamFactory is an API creation and management framework. And what we strive to do is eliminate many of these decisions that developers are otherwise required to make when building and maintaining APIs, right? We want to provide developers with a centralized solution for API and documentation generation, for the configuration and management of role-based access controls and API keys, for handling all of the user authentication issues that I described earlier, for managing your request limiting, your logging, your analytics, and so forth, right? We want you to be able to focus on building that API while leaving all of these commonplace details to DreamFactory. And as you'll see in the demo that I'll walk through in just a moment, DreamFactory supports a wide variety of native, what we refer to as connectors or services for quickly generating these APIs. And a partial list of those connectors is presented on this slide. So as you can see, for example, DreamFactory supports 19 different databases, and I'll in just a moment walk you through the creation of a MySQL API. However, DreamFactory also supports a number of NoSQL databases, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle, and so forth. In addition to these connectors, DreamFactory offers quite a diverse array of authentication capabilities, and you can see those at the top right of the slide. And those include basic HTTP, Active Directory, LDAP, OAuth, OpenID, and SAML. And you can just configure one of these authenticators and use that as a pretense to interacting with an API. Upon successful authentication, DreamFactory will return a session token for you, which can be supplied with all subsequent requests. So it's a very convenient way, a very low-code way for that matter, to add authentication to these APIs. And what this means is that you can use these commonplace traditional enterprise authentication solutions, such as Active Directory, as well as a variety of the popular cloud-based solutions, again, such as Okta, Auth0, and so forth. Also worth noting, in the right column, you'll see a reference to DreamFactory's supported scripting engines. You can use PHP, Python, Node, or the V8 scripting engine to both create entirely new APIs, as well as append business logic to existing API endpoints, right? And this opens up really a tremendous amount of possibilities, allowing you to, for instance, call multiple APIs as part of a single API request. I think to maybe put that in more concrete terms, imagine that you've built out or you're building out an e-commerce system, and that system's talking to DreamFactory. So when an order is submitted, and imagine that your e-commerce system is integrated with DreamFactory, and it makes an API call associated with an order submission. What DreamFactory can then do is it can insert that purchase record into a database, because of course you're going to want to persist that information. The customer data could then be sent to maybe Salesforce or Pipedrive or another CRM solution. And then a Slack message could be sent to your company channel, all as part of a single API call, right? Your e-commerce site talks to DreamFactory. DreamFactory triggers a number of different API-related tasks. And then finally, it turns around and in a response back to the e-commerce platform, it returns order details such as an order ID and things like that. All right, so it makes, DreamFactory makes these complex workflows far easier to deal with. And this approach to API generation and management really seems to have resonated with developers, because these days you'll find everyone from the smallest startup, smallest 1 and 2 person startup, to some of the largest companies in the world, in fact, using DreamFactory to streamline their API development processes. And I mean, really, just off the top of my head, in the past few months alone, we've worked with a number of city and state governments, both in the United States and overseas, retailers. We've worked with banks and financial institutions, gaming and leisure companies, travel companies, really you name it, and you name the industry, and chances are DreamFactory is making an impact there. And I think what's really interesting about the breadth of industries we deal with is it really shows you that no matter how small or how large the business is, or what type of business the organization is conducting, everybody is struggling with the challenge of building and maintaining these APIs. So finally, before we jump into the demo, for those of you wondering how to obtain DreamFactory, as Jed mentioned in the follow-up email, we'll include some additional information about doing so, but just a quick overview for you. You have several options, really. You can, as far as the easiest way goes, and I'm going to just jump out of my slide for a moment and head over to dreamfactory.com. You can get started by heading over to www.dreamfactory.com and pressing the Start Free Trial button located at the top of the page. And you're going to be taken to a site we launched just a few months ago called Genie. You'll fill out a short registration form here. And once you submit or start this trial, DreamFactory, a brand new DreamFactory instance will be created for you. And it's a 14-day trial. It contains everything found in our top-tier commercial version. And furthermore, it includes access to a test real-world MySQL database, which contains, I think it's like 4.5 million records. It's actually the sample employees database that is made available via the MySQL site. And what that does is it gives you again, a real-world database that you can use to create an API and then subsequently interact with it. Secondarily, if you wanted to trial DreamFactory's enterprise version within your own cloud or data center, you could contact us via the email address found at the bottom of the page, info@dreamfactory.com, and we'll get you situated right away. And then finally, we actually offer a very popular open source version. and it's very capable. Many companies around the globe use it. And to download that, just head on over to GitHub and search for DreamFactory. So with that said, let's move on to a quick demo. And I'll just switch screens here. So what I'd like to demonstrate, actually two demonstrations, I guess. First, I'll show you how easy it is to generate a new database-backed API using the DreamFactory platform. And then secondarily, I'll show you how easy it is to reuse these APIs within different applications by taking advantage of role-based access controls and API key generation. But maybe before I do that, I would imagine at least part of the audience, this is perhaps the first time you're being introduced to DreamFactory. So I'll just give you a very quick overview of what you're currently looking at. This is a web-based administration console that is included with all versions of the DreamFactory platform. And it's actually a client. It's bundled with DreamFactory, but it's not the platform itself. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because everything that you do within this web-based administration console, whether it's application key management or creating users or managing role-based access controls, it's actually all being done by way of system-related APIs that the platform has exposed for administrative reasons. And that is a really key point to understand, because what it means is you can integrate DreamFactory into other applications, right? If you were building some sort of API for use by your customers, and you wanted to make it available to a select set of customers as opposed to a public API that you might market through Rakuten RapidAPI, you could build an onboarding environment for those clients or customers. And when they create an account, you could contact DreamFactory by way of an API call, generate an API key, generate a role-based access control, generate a limit, and then return that key back to your onboarding environment, at which point it could be presented to your partner or customer for use, right? So it's offers a great way to extend the capabilities of existing systems or future systems that you intend to build. Now, that said, for many users, of course, you're not necessarily going to do everything programmatically. You're going to use this web-based interface for building and managing your APIs. And typically, the very first thing that users do after creating an administrative account is they're going to want to create an API. And you'll do that by clicking on the Services tab. And this is where all of your different services or APIs are managed and created. And to create an API, you're going to click on the Create link located on the left. And then you're going to choose a service type. And if I go ahead and click on that service type, you'll see that these different service types, again, or connectors, are broken into a number of different categories. And as I mentioned earlier, DreamFactory supports 19 different databases. And that, I mean, is without a doubt the platform's most popular capability. However, and I'll come back to this in just a moment, DreamFactory also supports the ability to create APIs for example, S3 or SFTP. That's a very popular connector. You can create APIs for various email delivery providers, for mobile notifications. You can create or you can add existing APIs to DreamFactory and then use DreamFactory as a proxy. In particular, this SOAP service is very popular. So we have a a lot of businesses that are using legacy SOAP services. However, the developers want to interact with them by way of REST. So DreamFactory will actually read the WSDL document and convert it to a REST interface, which can be much more convenient for developers today. You can create the scripted services that I discussed earlier using a number of different scripting engines. And in fact, here you'll see that we very recently added Python 3 support. You can, and I'll come back to these in a moment, you can interact with IoT devices by way of the AMQP and the MQTT protocols. You can interact with source control solutions such as Bitbucket, GitHub, and GitLab. You can create APIs for cache solutions, including Memcached and Redis. And you can also, and I'll show you an example of this in a bit, you can also integrate with the Elastic Stack environment. So you can do real-time performance tracking and analytics. And then just doubling back to the OAuth category, as far as authentication goes, I mentioned this already, but you can integrate with OAuth for authentication purposes, OpenID Connect, Active Directory and LDAP, and then finally with SAML 2.0 for single sign-on purposes. So there's a great many number of capabilities built into the platform. However, for sake of demonstration, I'd like to show you how easy it is to create a MySQL API. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the database category and choose MySQL. And before doing this, it's worth noting that whether you're creating an Oracle API or a Postgres API or a Microsoft SQL Server API, the process that I'm about to walk through it's identical, right? And that's a big deal to us at DreamFactory. We want the process to be uniform, so there's no surprises. So you're going to be able to repeatedly return to your DreamFactory environment, create a new database API, and not wonder whether this process is different each time, right? So I'll go ahead and choose MySQL, and I'll start by giving it a name. And we'll call it Rakuten. I've made this all lowercase, all alphanumeric characters, because this is going to serve as the namespace for the API. And we'll assign it a label, and finally a description. And next up, I'm going to leave it active because we're going to use it right away. And next up, I'm going to click on the config tab. And it's here where we're going to supply a set of credentials for interacting with that destination database. And can everybody still hear me? Are we still good?
Yeah, everything's good here.
Okay, there was a weird behavior with my Zoom just a moment ago, and part of the interface disappeared in another screen. So just making sure we didn't have any internet problems.
We can pretty much hear you. Thanks.
Great, thank you. So all you're going to do here is supply a set of credentials for connecting to that destination database. That destination database does not have to reside on the DreamFactory server. It doesn't have to reside within the same cloud environment, right? We're just concerned about a firewall issue, of course, and credentials. So I'm going to connect to one of our test DreamFactory databases. This is incidentally the very same database in terms of content that you are given when interacting or starting your trial, which is very convenient. And finally, I'm just going to paste in the password. Now, as far as required parameters go, that's it. You're going to supply these credentials. You do have the option of modifying a number of optional parameters here. You can specify the character set, the time zone. You can override the connecting driver behavior, which can occasionally be useful. You can cap the maximum number of records returned. And I think finally, and perhaps most importantly from a use, the standpoint of common use, you can enable data caching, right? So if you're working in a high volume environment, DreamFactory is already quite performant out of the box, but if you wanted to squeeze some additional performance out of the platform, you could check this box and then define a cache time to live. And DreamFactory will use whatever caching layer you've defined in the configuration, whether that's Redis or memcached, and cache those results for that specified period of time. But I'll leave all of this untouched, and I'll just press save. And you can see that we've been told our service has been saved successfully. I'll close my annoying password manager. And what DreamFactory did upon pressing save is it generated a full-featured REST API. It generated all of the associated documentation. Because we left the checkbox set to active, it deployed the API, and finally it secured the API because there's no such concept as a public API in DreamFactory. You can't mistakenly deploy an API that could be accessed by some curious or malicious third party, because everything is protected by, at minimum, an API key. And I'll talk more about that in just a moment. So after creating the API, what I typically recommend is that you head on over to API docs to review the API endpoints. So I'll search for Rakuten, and here we are, and I'll select it, and you can see here that we're provided with all of these endpoints. These have all been generated as part of that creation process. And if I scroll back up to the top, you'll see that you can call stored functions and stored procedures. You'll see that you can inspect and interact with the schema. And at the bottom, most commonly, you'll see that these are the CRUD API endpoints, the create, retrieve, update, and delete endpoints. And for example, if I click on retrieve one or more records, you'll see that this documentation is interactive because it's Swagger documentation or Open API documentation. And if I click the try it out button, all of these parameters that this particular endpoint supports have been enabled or made available for you to experiment with. You can select specific fields. You can join tables together. You can filter, so this would be the where clause in a SQL query. You can limit, you can offset, you can order, you can group, you can count. Anything that you would typically do with a SQL query, you can do by way of making API calls through the DreamFactory environment. And just as a quick example, if I scroll down to the bottom of these field listing, and I enter the employees table name and press execute, and scroll down a little further, you'll see that the records found in that employees table have been returned. We also have a 200 status code. And then finally, and I think most importantly for learning purposes, you'll see what the URI looks like for this particular endpoint. And there is that namespace that I referred to earlier, right? So what's great about this documentation is because it's interactive, it gives you and your fellow developers the opportunity to become familiar with the API without having to open up your code editor and start searching around and trying to piece things together via Stack Overflow or whatever. You have an immediate available resource for learning and understanding how to interact with that API. Incidentally, up at the top, if I return to the top, you'll see there's a users tab, and you can create users and provide them with access to just the documentation. So they're not, of course, not going to be administrators, right? You're going to provide them with restricted access to the DreamFactory environment. that gives them access to this documentation. If I scroll back down to this endpoint and, for example, set the limit to 2, so we're going to return 2 results, I'll press execute, and it's really no surprise that we do in fact receive 2 results. But more importantly, as I mentioned before, you can see what you need to provide to the API to produce that desired behavior, right? And the same idea applies to table joins, to filters, and so forth, right? It's a very convenient way to understand how to interact with the API. So, I mean, that's API and documentation generation in a nutshell. There's no code involved. There's clearly not a lot of decision making to be had. You're going to create a set of credentials for the desired database. You're going to provide them to DreamFactory. You're going to generate the API, and then you're going to begin using it, right? And that's really what brings me to the second example that I'd like to show you. So you clearly, the API docs is useful for learning about the API, but sooner or later, you're going to want to use this API within an intranet application or a mobile application, a web application, or anywhere else where you intend to consume that API. And that brings me to API reuse. And it's a very useful example to dovetail with the generation example, because it gives me the opportunity to actually talk about 2 topics: API reuse, or reusing or using the same API within different applications, and also role-based access controls and API keys, because you can't implement reuse without understanding how role-based access controls and API keys work. And in order to apply a role-based access control in DreamFactory, I'm going to go to the Roles tab. If I click on the Roles tab and press Create, I'm going to create a role or a set of privileges to be applied to an API key that's going to be used to interact with that API we just created a moment ago. And I'm going to call this the Rakuten role. Actually, we're going to call it the Rakuten mobile application role. And I'll assign the same to the description. We will make it active. I'll press the Access tab and then press the plus button. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to choose the Rakuten API that we just created. And when I do, this component dropdown is going to be filled with all of the endpoints that you can access through that API. And if I scroll down, well, I could start by providing wide open access to that API by setting this to star. But what if you only wanted to provide access to a particular table in that API or in that database, and you wanted to restrict access to everything else? No, there's no access to stored procedures, no access to other tables, no access to the schema, etc. All I'd have to do is go down and choose my table. So I'll choose the employees table. Now imagine that you just want to make it read only. I can click on the access drop down here, and I have all of my REST verbs here: get, post, put, patch, and delete. I can choose get. And finally, by leaving this set to API, this can only be accessed by way of this, and this role is only accessible, or it can only access the API by way of API calls, as opposed to within scripts, which is the subject of another day. Now, if I save that role, right, I've defined it, and I can go over to the Apps tab next, and this is where I'm going to manage my API keys. And I'm going to press the Create button located on the left, and we're going to call this the Rakuten mobile application, right? So we're getting ready to use this API within some mobile application. I'll make it active, No storage required because the code for this is going to be, excuse me, managed elsewhere. And finally, I'm just going to attach this API key to the Rakuten role. And I'll press save. And once I do, if I scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that an API key has been generated. And if I copy that key and open up Insomnia, which is just an HTTP tool, you can use this to test API requests. You'll see that I've already pre-populated the URL here with the same endpoint that we are interacting with via API docs. So what happens if I press send? If I press send, we get a 400 status code because we did not abide by the server requirements or the application requirements of sending along an API key. As I mentioned before, there's no such thing as a public API in DreamFactory. Now, if I take that API key that we just created and paste it into this header, notice this header is called x-dreamfactory-api-key. I'm passing in that key. I press send, and sure enough, here come the employee records, right? But what happens if I attempt to contact the departments table, which is another table found in that database, and press send? We get a 401 unauthorized because the role indicated that this particular API key can only contact the employees table, right? Now, if I return to DreamFactory and update my role for Rakuten, I'll go to Access. I'm going to add the departments table to this role, so we're going to be able to contact both employees and departments. We'll make it read-only as well. And if I press save and return to Insomnia and press send once more, now the departments have come back, right? So everything's point and click. There's not a lot of decision making to be had here. Very easy to use. Now, incidentally, now that I've added the departments role, I can go to this endpoint where we do a table join. And I'll just update that to Rakuten. And I need to do one more thing. I need to paste in this API key. And now if I press send, whoops, I have to update our role one more time to include the join table, department EMP. So I'll go down here, I'll return to the Access tab, and I'll add that department EMP table. Here, read only once more. I'll press save. I'll return to Insomnia, press send one last time, and now you can see that the join data has been added. And that's done with this related parameter. So we've created a very constrained, very select definition of what it is that that particular API key can do, right? And now we're using this in our mobile application, right? But now imagine I'm creating an intranet application that's intended to be used by our internal staff. And it's going to use that very same database. Now, you could, as many companies do, go about creating some other version of that API or piling a bunch of role-based logic into that API in order to accommodate this reuse. Or if you're using DreamFactory, you create a new role. And we'll call this the Rakuten intranet application. And I've given a description. I'll set it to active. And again, same process. I'm going to go to the Access tab. I'm going to press plus. I'm going to choose Rakuten. I'm going to leave this set to star because we might want to take advantage of stored procedures. We might want to take advantage of views and so forth. I'm going to open up, let's call it administrative level access to this API, and I'm going to press save. Next up, I'll do exactly what I did before. I'll go to the Apps tab. I'll press Create. We'll call it the Rakuten. Assign a description. We're going to, again, manage this application somewhere else. Assign the role. I'll press Save, and there's our new API key. And if I copy that key in, and I'll put it here so we can save the other one, I'll disable the old key. Now remember that we had an issue attempting to, for example, interact with the department EMP table. If I press send, of course, I'm going to have total access to this, but I also have access to all of the other tables, such as the salaries table, right? I can also insert records, I can patch records, I can delete, because we've assigned total access to that particular role, right? So hopefully this short demonstration shows you just how easy it is to generate APIs using the DreamFactory platform, allow it to take care of all of these decisions that you'd otherwise have to make, right? I mean, just think about, maybe as a parting thought, just think about the amount of aggravation that that the DreamFactory platform just saved your development team by generating that API, assigning the role, and making it really instantly available for your team to use. And I guess before we open it up for any questions, if you have any questions at all after the presentation's over about the DreamFactory environment, I certainly invite you to email me directly at jason.gilmore@dreamfactory.com. You can email our team at info@dreamfactory.com or jump on the phone via this phone number. And finally, I invite you to learn more about the various products that we offer at www.dreamfactory.com. Thank you.
Yeah, great presentation, Jason. And thanks for walkthrough of DreamFactory. And I can see our participants are really interested about DreamFactory and wanted to know more. So let me just survey some of the questions that we have right now from the chat. So from Koa, he asked, what are the advantages and disadvantages compared to MuleSoft? Yeah. So this question is for you, Jason.
So this is a great question. If you head over to, give me one moment here. Let me, whoops, I guess I shouldn't have stopped. Give me one moment to pull up. Let me go back to the screen share. If you head over to dreamfactory.com, you'll find at the bottom that we actually have a breakdown of, I mean, DreamFactory versus Microsoft or versus MuleSoft. I'm not sure that's the correct description. But in a nutshell, what you'll find when comparing products such as DreamFactory, MuleSoft, DreamFactory, and Apigee is that DreamFactory can do, as far as the typical commonplace tasks that API developers desire to do, DreamFactory is going to do 90% of them. It's going to manage service creation, API key management, role-based access controls, data transformation by way of a data mesh feature that the platform offers. For what I mean by that is you can attach business logic to any endpoint and convert your request or your responses on the fly using scripting, so you can transform them to be anything that you need them to be. You can use data mapping, meaning you can take, so DreamFactory can do table joins, as I demonstrated, but you can also join multiple databases together using the API. Even if we're talking about a MySQL database and a SQL Server database, you can actually join those two databases together and present results via a single API call. You can cache data. There's transaction support. You can do analytics via Elastic Stack. You can limit. There's high availability available. So all of those features are bundled into DreamFactory. All of those features are bundled into MuleSoft. Beyond that, MuleSoft offers, a great number of additional features, right? Support for scripting or engines such as Java, Groovy, and Ruby. DreamFactory doesn't yet support that, although we are working on adding additional scripting engines. MuleSoft uses an enterprise service bus. DreamFactory doesn't take that approach. So the question you have to ask when making these comparisons is which tool can I most effectively use for my particular project or business requirements? What does the learning curve look like? What does the cost look like? And I would venture to say that for many, not for all, for many cases, you're going to find that DreamFactory is going to fit your needs quite well.
Yeah, that's awesome. So, Jason, do you have an example for authorization?
For authorization or authentication?
I have this questions from one of our audience. Yeah, so do you want to add in any details about this question? Example for authorization.
So, I mean, an authorization example would pertain to the RBAC examples that I walk through. So the role-based access control is going to determine what it is that a user can do from an authorization standpoint. Perhaps if the audience member meant authentication, if you head over to guide.dreamfactory.com and go to chapter 4, which is authenticating and monitoring users, this is very much still a work in progress, but you'll see numerous examples where we walk through authenticating with OpenID Connect, where we show you how to authenticate with Okta. You can also, as I mentioned, authenticate with LDAP, Active Directory. And in fact, if I jump over or back to Insomnia and go here, these are just a bunch of internal examples that we use. Here's an LDAP authentication example, or this is just some LDAP server that we've created. And if I press send, you'll see that a session token has been returned for this particular user, and that's the JWT token that was referenced in the slide from earlier. That token has a certain lifetime, and you'll just supply that token with all of your subsequent calls, which allows you to identify that particular user.
Great. Yeah, I think we have questions from Arun. He asked, what are the API testing feature available on DreamFactory?
So as far as testing goes, would this be from a load testing standpoint, or what exactly?
Yeah. Is Aaron still here? Like, or we can add some details to your questions. Okay, functionality standpoint.
From a functionality standpoint, there's nothing built into the platform itself. However, of course, you could, I mean, as part of your application development process, set up integration tests to ensure that your client is receiving the desired output. As far as load testing goes, if anybody's interested in that topic, when there's a, what's the word, a better or a more capable third-party tool available, we very much prefer to refer users to it, right? Because that's their area of expertise. That's where they've put their time and effort into. I certainly recommend having a look at loader.io. That's LOADER.io. Loader.io is a really great testing tool, our load testing tool that we use to load test the DreamFactory environment. Works very well. I think there's a free tier for getting started. You could also use tools like Apache Bench and things like that. But I found over the years, whether with DreamFactory or with my prior engagements, that using Loader has always been a really great experience.
Okay, that's great. Do we still have any other questions from our participants today? If not, then I will ask one question for you, Jason. So
Sure.
Your platform addresses the issues of like optimization performance. So do you have any examples for the performance monitoring or like usage analytics?
Well, great question. And this really dovetails nicely with the previous, where our preference is to either point users to or integrate with other solutions that can handle those sorts of features more capably. And to answer this specific question, the DreamFactory integrates with the Elastic Stack environment, and that's Elasticsearch, Logstash, and Kibana. Or you could use Grafana or another visualization tool. And that's done within DreamFactory by going to Create, going to Log, choosing Logstash, and again, as always, you'll fill out your name, label, and description, but then under the Config tab, you'll specify your Logstash host, the port, what protocol you'd like to use, and then you'll identify what data you would like to forward on to Logstash and therefore onwards to the destination repository. And then here, you'll choose which APIs you'd like to forward that data to, right? And once that's in place, you can create these cool dashboards, such as this simple one we've created in Kibana, to perform real-time monitoring of your API environment, right? So, for example, this chart is telling us how many status codes have been returned by API calls. Naturally, you want to pay attention to the 500s. The number of calls each user has made over time, and you'll see, this is myself and my colleague Kevin, what methods are being used and what frequency, calls by role. I think there's just one here, just the admin role. I think this is attached to that demo environment that I was showing you, in fact. This is an extraordinarily simple example of a dashboard. You could track by IP address. You could monitor your limits in real time. You could use other parts of Elasticsearch and Kibana to create reports. And if I jump over to here, for example, you'll see that this is the Elasticsearch raw data, right, that's being dumped out. And you'll see there's, again, this is data that we've chosen, but you have your request headers, your content types, and so on and so forth. So you could take that data and use it to build any sort of dashboard chart that you see fit, right? Also, just to add to this, now that I'm thinking about it, when you use Logstash, so your DreamFactory data is going to be sent on to Logstash. Logstash is going to turn around and forward it on to some destination. Typically, that's Elasticsearch, but it doesn't have to be Elasticsearch. because there's all of these plugins that Logstash supports that allow you to forward it on to, for example, another database, right? By way of JDBC or I think ODBC, you can forward it on. So you're not required to use the full Elastic Stack, although it's very nice. You're not required to use it.
Okay, great. And I think we have another 2 questions from the audience. So how about for sensitive data? For example, how to handle tokenization feature?
How to handle, what was the question?
A tokenization feature.
So in regards to, could you give me an example?
Yeah, it's a problem here. Yeah, we can add some details to your questions. Sensitive data.
So if, I could talk about this for hours, but I mean, the sensitive data question, we have customers who deal with GDPR, for example. So the data privacy regulations in Europe. And there are other variations of this around the world. For example, South Africa deals with PAPI. So that's their personal privacy regulation. What our customers do in those situations is they make heavy use of, again, DreamFactory's role management capabilities. In addition to, and I mean, this is worthy of a webinar unto itself, DreamFactory's scripting capabilities. And DreamFactory's scripting capabilities allow you to attach business logic to any endpoint for reasons of, again, maybe coordinating multiple API calls together, or examining requests as they come in and filtering or stripping unwanted or unneeded data from those requests. And then on the flip side, you can attach business logic to the response side. So what many of our users will do is they will use scripting, and I'll just dig down here and show you an example of a scripting example. So once you've arrived at an endpoint, so we are in a SQL Server API, we're looking at the customer table, it's a GET request to that customer table, and this is a post-process event, meaning the data has come back from the database environment, and we are going to do something with it. We're going to transform that response prior to it being returned to the customer or the end user. And what does that do something mean? That do something could mean we're going to replace part of a phone number with asterisks, right? Or we're going to remove the date of birth altogether. Or we're going to rearrange the way that some of the attribute values are returned, and so on and so forth. You have total control over the way that the response is formatted and returned to the user. So I guess in answer to that question, the typical way to deal with sensitive data is to use roles to make sure that we're not returning something that we shouldn't be, and naturally to ensure that unwanted parties aren't inserting or modifying or deleting data. And then they'll use scripting that'll go hand in hand with the role-based management in order to ensure that, one, the client's not inserting or passing along values they shouldn't be, and then two, on the response side, to ensure that we're not returning any unwanted data. There are also, I mean, as I mentioned, this is worthy of an entire presentation unto itself. I mean, there are also other common tasks that our users do, and such as create a scripted service. And they'll create a scripted service that presents just a very simple endpoint, such as /API/Rakuten, right? And when that API endpoint is contacted, your scripted service will turn around and contact a different endpoint within the platform, right? Therefore masking the behavior of that destination endpoint, and even masking the fact that it exists in the first place. So you almost create a proxy for that endpoint where you can tightly control the data as it flows into and out of the platform.
Yeah, I think that's great tips for protecting sensitive data and accessibility. And also we have another question. So if I'm using a SQL database or a NoSQL database, where should I be putting the credentials?
You're just going to supply those at creation time within the services tab. So I've gone to the services tab. I'll click create, and then I'm going to choose my service type. And when I choose my service type, if we're going to create a database API, you again have these 19 different databases to choose from. And this is one of my favorite aspects of the platform, whether it's DB2 or SQL Server or Postgres or Oracle or MySQL and so forth, I'll go to SQL Server this time. Regardless of your database type, this process is identical. You're going to supply that namespace that I referred to a moment ago, label and description, and you'll click on the config tab, and it's the same process all over again. You're going to provide your host, your port number, your database, your username, and your password. And when you save that, what DreamFactory is really going to do is it's going to reach out to your database, and it's going to build a map of that database, right? And it's going to cache a map, not the data. It's going to cache the map of that database to the platform. So we're not constantly reaching out to try and understand what tables or columns or column attributes are associated with that database, right? It's going to build that map and then use that map until some subsequent point in time where you've cleared your cache map. And that's done through the config tab, incidentally, because your database schema naturally is going to change over time. So when it changes, you're not going to have to come back into the service definition and recreate it or do anything like that. You'll clear your cache, at which point DreamFactory will read in your new schema definition, cache that, and then use that for all subsequent calls. So you're just going to supply your credentials one time, and DreamFactory is going to take care of the rest.
Yeah, that's great. And do you have any other additional questions for Jason? Okay.
I could talk all day, I promise.
I think we have a feedback from Ricard. Yeah, a very informative session so far, and really appreciate Jason for sharing your expertise and demonstration and walkthrough with us using DreamFactory platform. Yeah, that's a great
thank you very much.
presentation. Yeah,
I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody for staying up into the evening at your location. Thank you.
Yeah, so if other people have other questions for DreamFactory, where can they find you?
Great. Head on over to www.dreamfactory.com, and we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Can you come? And is there any questions for Rakuten RapidAPI or for DreamFactory? We can, if not, then we can probably write it out. Yeah. So, Jet, do you have anything to add?
No, not particularly. It's a great session. I want to thank Jason for joining us. For like our participants who have made time for this session, hope you found it informative. We are looking for guest speakers. So if we can help you out with APIs for applications that you're developing, whether it's a production or demo, feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in like a guest speaking spot, and we can like plan for something for you.
Okay, great. So I guess, yeah, thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for taking time to attend the sessions. We'll have more in the future, so keep an eye on our meetup page. Yeah. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Jed.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.